The North End was a busy, vibrant area, filled with wonderful characters. And here's one old North Ender's memories of some of them, when as a small boy he walked these streets. The daily bustle of the street had given way to the early evening quiet. The crowds of workers from the docks and savages had passed through, and the hush of twilight soothed the air and sighed through the churchyard trees as I drifted slowly home from the chapel. The shadowy doorway of Humphrey's chandlery yawned tiredly in the dusky light, and breathed out its heady scent of creosote and paint, which perfumed the cool night air and dappled the sleeping pavements below. Only a few of the street regulars were to be seen. Barber Seaman was still coughing and clipping, hurrying his last customer behind the striped pool, and across the street Southcote's windows glowed like Christmas with a warm promise of inexpensive delights. Outside, Harry fussed with quick darting movements over his trays and boxes, straightening a ticket here and an apple there, whilst keeping a smiling face and a careful eye out for a potential customer. The plates on my boots echoed to the slow, dreamy rhythm of my feet on the pavements as they carried me down the street and past the cottages, their lighted, smiling windows singing a lullaby in my head. An early star stirred sleepily in the depths of a dying sky and hid its face behind the dark, tumbled chimney pots that stood guard over the mysterious shadows in Mr. Bunton's cool yard. In the fading light, I slipped quietly past a dark woman who was in her usual position, standing on the doorway, smoking her clay pipe, arms folded across her chest, looking out into the street. She was an old lady, foreign and exotic as a gypsy queen. Her skin was the colour of coffee, wrinkled and seamed like leather. When she spoke, there was the gleam of a gold tooth, and from her lobes hung heavy and intricately formed gold earrings. A dark shawl covered her head, and beneath it her hair peeped out as black as tar, wavy and curled, falling in ringlets to her shoulders. She was dressed all in black, a black blouse over a long black skirt with something white at her throat. A large brooch was pinned at her breast, and on her feet she wore black leather winkle pickers, laced up high above her ankles. The scarred face of her companion peered fearfully from the shadows behind. A dim yellow lamp gleamed behind the dusty brown screens which covered the low windows of the Dock Tavern, and I peered in hopefully at the ghostly forms that swayed and danced in the fluttering firelight. Mr. Biggs, as solid and still as a chapel door, stood high on his step watching the street. Paper-licking fingers thrust florins deep into the hungry pockets of his brown overall. A Ganseed fisherman stopped for a moment, and they disappeared into the shop. I thought of all those racks of comics just waiting to be read. Across the boneyard, Polly Goodson's loomed lightless over the pavement, as shuttered and dark as January, and I quickly scurried past towards the beckoning warmth of Aunt Nell's sweet shop. In the sea-smelling, water-washed dimness of the street, the lamplighter was already busy with his long hooked pole deftly clicking on the streetlights. The cosy yellow glow fell as soft rain onto the pavements, turning into puddles of gold through which I splashed noisily, scattering the darkness with 1,000 jewel drops, and startling a soot-backed star-black feline who lurked with crafty eyes in the night hunter's gloom of Begley's yard. The windows of Aunt Nell's sweet shop shone out warm and inviting, and I stopped to daydream over the trays of licorice all sorts and sherbet dips, but I didn't have a penny to spend today. From somewhere in the distance I could hear the rattling song of a barrow echoing over the cobbles as it made its way home from the fleet. The old rat-catcher passed me, wearily pushing his bike as though too tired to mount. His long spoon pool was tied securely to his crossbar, and he puffed his cheeks out with every step. Uncle Ryler was turning into his passage when he saw me and said, "Boy, Arthur." He was carrying a large sack over his shoulders. He must have been down below when I caught the familiar homely smell of fish, tar and salt water that clung to him from the boat. There was the sound of horses' hooves on the cobbles as Mr. Howlett drove his cart up the passage of the waiting yard to the stable at the rear, and in the drowsy half-light I could see his wife bringing in the parrot which hung in its cage beside her door. It was silent tonight, quietened by the dusk. Gone was its usual warning cry of "Martha, Martha," which alerted her whenever she had customers for her homemade ice cream and toffee apples. Along the street, Mr. Bennell, the one-legged cobbler, shook his keys with dark leathery hands into the wide pocket of his work-stained apron and limped slowly into the night. The comforting roundness of Plessy wobbled precariously on the back of a kitchen chair as she cleaned the marks left by a dozen pointing sticky fingers on the windows of her shop. She saw me and said, "Time you was home for your tea." The midnight gardener passed, a silent grey bespectacled ghost. He'd made his way up Pilot Street, ragged coat tied round his waist with an untidy knot of string, and more string holding his trouser legs into the calves. There was a usual tray of vegetables balanced on his head, and he looked neither right nor left, and seemed to notice nothing nor nobody. I watched the blind man, with marbled unseeing eyes, walk the pavement with all the assurance of the sighted. Immaculately dressed in white shirt and tie, and his bowler hat firmly in place, he moved forward in his dark world towards the bright warmth of the Fisherman's Arms to play dominoes. He was a difficult man to beat at the game, for he knew the value of each card by touch, and always remembered who laid what. He would recognise his friends by their footsteps, and often surprise them by calling out their name. Blinded in the First World War, he had overcome his handicap in such a cheerful way that many people had forgotten that he was without sight. There was a grating noise as the gates were closed, and I looked up as a tired train heaved itself off the docks, puffed wearily across the street, dragging its family of wagons behind it. They clunked softly over the crossing, the sound of their wheels muffled by the heavy stillness of the evening air, each one briefly illuminated in the street lamps, like the unwinding of some slow-motion film. Close by, framed in the yellow, spot-lit doorway of the Fisherman's Return, Aunt Charlotte tugged at her turban and watched the parade glide past, as the steam from the engine billowed and swirled in a spectral dance round her apron-wrapped figure, making her appear and disappear as though in a dream where things are and things aren't. A few people were hurrying past the darkness of the Methodist chapel towards the lights of the Pilot as I turned the corner, opened the back gate, crossed the yard, and went into the snug warmth of the little passage where the gas cooker stood. I could hear the girls laughing in the front room and smelt cigarette smoke. She was busy with the old blue enamel frying pan. It was one of our favourites, Bubble and Squeak. She saw me and smiled. "It's only me, Mum," I said.